So I'll let you know the next time if my check has been docked. The reason why I say that is this morning I asked Dad to read, and I said, it's like 15 verses. It'll be 3 slides. Can you do it? And then I texted Kevin a few days ago and told him what the reading was. I said it contains every city in Greece and Italy and everywhere else. So I guess if the elders aren't happy with the choices that I've made for them, my pay will be slightly minimized next time. So I'll let you know about that. But tonight we are going to be talking about, as we maybe could tell from Acts 27, what Kevin read was the Paul's shipwreck. And I don't know about you, or I guess I'm speaking to anybody here who maybe speaks, but I find myself every time that somebody else is speaking, I end up taking down things that I want to speak about. Usually it has nothing to do with whatever the sermon would be, but it might be something that they say to turn to or to look at. I end up most of the time turning to the wrong page, and then that catches my eye there in the process. So this was actually something that kind of popped up to me, I think, during the gospel meeting. It might have been mentioned. I don't know if it was mentioned, but I saw it while it was during the gospel meeting. But anyway, that's what we'll be looking at tonight. So I have a question for you to start with. How comfortable are you on a boat? How comfortable are you on a boat? Well, there's a lot of different kinds of boats, right? And I would imagine our comfortability may depend on what kind of boat we are actually on. You know, we can go from anywhere from a John boat all the way up to a cruise ship, right? You know, if you were in the Navy, you might have been stationed on some type of naval ship, some kind of warship or something along those lines. You may have a canoe at home. You may have been whitewater rafting at some point. You may, if you got plenty of money, you may have a yacht, or you may have seen yachts that people had that you would never be able to afford, somewhere along those lines. But for a lot of us, being on a boat provides a little bit of nervousness, maybe. What's our biggest fear of being on a boat? Well, I would imagine the biggest fear of being on a boat is no longer being on the boat shortly thereafter, right? I would imagine sinking would be the biggest fear. And there's just something about sinking on a boat that it just seems it's a little different. I don't know what it is. There's something different about that than a car that it might be. And so the story that we're looking tonight is about Paul on his way to Rome. But more than that, I want us to think about sinking for a second. And do we ever feel like in life we're kind of sinking? Do you ever have those situations where it seems like you're sinking there in the process? Now, tonight we're going to be following, as it were, sort of Paul's, well, let's just use the word adventure. I don't know, it depends on what you like the word adventure or not, but Paul's adventure across the seas here. But as you can see from the title here, our title is Shipwrecked, but then Lessons from the Storms of Life. And that's what we're going to be thinking about here this evening. Now, first of all, let's go into the story just a little bit. On the way to Rome, and we didn't really have time or the ability to read everything, but we'll be looking at quite a bit here as we go. But Paul was on his way to Rome as a prisoner because of his appeal to Caesar. In fact, in Acts chapter 26, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, Paul had appealed before Caesar, and some of the more famous verses in the scriptures, especially in the book of Acts, are found right there. But as we read there, as Kevin read there just a moment ago, a Roman centurion named Julius, who was of the royal guard, had been given the responsibility of guarding Paul on the way to Rome. And Paul was a prisoner here. And so, as you could imagine, Paul being a prisoner, you would think that there would need to be some protection. I don't think Paul would be described as a violent prisoner. And by most examples we've seen, he wasn't going to run away. But that kind of excuse doesn't work when you're transporting a prisoner from point A to point B. You still don't let them sit in the front seat. You still don't let them roam free whenever you are doing this. There were other prisoners on the ship with them. And Julius seems, though, to have respected Paul and treated him kindly, as it were. And when they'd stopped at side, and he allowed Paul the freedom to visit the Christians who were there in the process. Now, the journey up the coast had been slow because they had been sailing into some heavy winds. Now, I'm kind of fascinated by sailing, even though I've never done it. And I think the idea of it seems pretty neat. I've read a lot of things about it, but it seems really difficult to be able to do. And one of the things that I talk about in my world history class with my students is in the 14 and 1500s, they had developed, Arab sailors had developed them, and that allowed them to catch either way. And so you could always be going forward. But I don't know that that thing exists right here, because what we see is there's a lot of downtime. And if the winds are against you, you're just out of luck. They finally arrived at the port of Myra, where they got on a larger cargo ship that was transporting grain from Italy. If you've ever heard the term killing two birds with one stone, that's kind of what we've got going on right here. They're trying to get Paul to where he's supposed to go along with these other prisoners, but they're transporting some other stuff along the way. And they were still having trouble with winds, and so the whole journey is really slow. Now, I asked you a minute ago, what's your big fear about being on a boat? And some of you may have an answer you may have developed an answer. But for some of you, it might be not being able to get off the boat. Well, a slow trip would have been very unexciting for a lot of us. They finally arrived, as Kevin read there, toward the end at a place called Fair Havens, but it was getting late in the year, and Paul tells them, he tries to tell them, we don't need to go any further. Let's stop right here. The captain and owner of the ship, who with the crew convinced the centurion that they knew more than Paul. Now, you can imagine this. Why do you think they're probably thinking Paul's saying, let's not go any further? Well, he's delaying his prison trip, right? And so they're saying, no, we got to get it going. But they've got food on here as well. They've got grains on here as well. And this is how they made money. So they're going to go on because they got to generate, they've got to get paid for what they're doing. So they set sail, intending to make it to another port in the island of Crete, which would be a good place to spend the winter. It had hardly begun, and guess what? The winds began blowing again. They couldn't handle the wind, so they let it drive them. All of this is in Acts chapter 27. They ungirded the ship with ropes and began to throw things overboard to lighten the ship. That would allow it to ride higher on the waves, and ultimately, after many days of it being unabated, most of them considered that life was about over. This was not going to work out well. Turn to Acts chapter 27. Acts chapter 27, I'm going to start with verse 21. And the first 20 verses are kind of what I summed up there just a little bit. But in Acts chapter 27, starting in verse 21, but after a long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed for Crete and incurred this disaster. Now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. Stood up in front of them and said, listen, you all were wrong. We should not have done this. We should not have been doing this. But he gave them some words of encouragement, right? He said, it's a really, you know what's going to happen here is the ship's going to sink. The encouragement, though, is you're going to survive. Now, what's going to happen to the ship? Well, it's going to be gone, but you're going to survive. And I would imagine for us, that would be comforting, right? It may still be a little hard to believe when you're jostling around on the waters, but it's comforting to know that I'm going to survive. For the ship owner, it may not be as exciting, right? They'd probably rather sink in the process. Obviously, not have had much of an appetite. We get a little seasick, right? You get a little seasick there. And so Paul says, you know what? Let's have a little something to eat. I can imagine that there was people in that boat who thought that's the absolute last thing I want to do right now is eat something after this boat has been tossing and turning. But when do we eat? It's a time, a little bit of comfort there, right? Paul, nobody might have felt like eating at this time, but Paul took the bread, gave thanks to God, and passed out something for them to eat. Now, that's very comforting. Let's go skip ahead to verse 37 in Acts chapter 27. Verse 39, I'm sorry. Starting in verse 9. So what happens is he blesses this, and they have this shipwreck. Starting in verse 39. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. and they let go the anchors and left them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where two seas meet, they ran the ship aground. And the prow struck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' plans was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ships. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. So we see here Paul in this story takes charge, and the ship's going to sink. And whenever the ship sinks, the first thing that the centurions wanted to do was kill the prisoners. Now think about that for a second. What would be the reason for wanting to kill the prisoners? There's probably a couple of reasons. One, nobody's going to really care is maybe the main thing. But you're going aground on a foreign island, an unknown island. Odds are food's going to be pretty limited. Let's kill the people who don't need to be there, and we will have food for ourselves. But remember, at the beginning, Paul had befriended this man named Julius. And Julius stands up for him and says, they are not going to be killed. They said, those of you that can swim, jump overboard and swim in. The rest of them floated in on the debris that was off of the ship that would lead them in there in the process. By all accounts here, however you want to say it, this would have certainly been a difficult, challenging thing. But it seems like in what we've seen in all of this, Paul has the best attitude of anybody there. And Paul's the prisoner, and Paul is facing near death only to survive and probably go face near death again. But Paul viewed this with a different way. So what I want us to look at here tonight are 4 lessons from the storm. 4 lessons from the storm. Lesson number 1. Paul was in the storm through no fault of his own. First of all, it's arguable that Paul probably didn't even need to be arrested and sent to Rome in the first place. You can look at that in Acts chapter 26. But Paul is on the ship, and Paul has repeatedly on the ship said what? We don't need to sail right now. And we looked at that and we thought, oh, well, he's just trying to get out of. No, he was telling them the truth. We don't need to sail. And so Paul was in this storm through no fault of his own. So what does it mean for us? Well, first of all, God hadn't promised to deliver us from the storms of life. How many storms do we come across in our daily life? Now, Christianity would be a whole lot easier, a whole lot better, a whole lot more enjoyable if nothing bad ever happened, right? I signed up for Christianity because I thought nothing bad would ever happen. Now, that's not the way it works, is it? It doesn't matter if we're Christian or not. What's going to happen in our life? Everything good always? Probably not. There's going to be storms in life. The reason we're Christians is in part to help abate those storms, in part to help calm those storms for us. Sometimes we experience severe storms when we realize what? That we have no control over the situation. That's maybe the most troubling part. I asked you a minute ago, what are you worried about when you're on a boat? For a lot of people, it may have been that I don't have any control of the situation. One of the most challenging things that we face in life is when those storms arise, sometimes we don't have any control of the situation. That makes things perhaps even more difficult. We feel sometimes our life is out of control. Maybe we're being driven by circumstances that are out of control. We read there, they didn't see the sun and stars for many days. You can see that in Acts chapter 27. They were engulfed in darkness. And sometimes we kind of feel the same way, right? I know I can look out the window and see the sun, or I can see the stars, but do we ever feel like we're kind of engulfed in darkness? These storms are sort of overwhelming us as we go. They'd given up hope of surviving, right? They were going to go down with the ship. And sometimes we even can get to that point as well. Number 2, second lesson from the storm. The Lord was with Paul in the storm. And that's an important one for us to think about as well. But it's important for you to say, now, wait a minute. He was with Paul, but we literally just read what happened to the boat. Well, the boat sank. But the Lord was with him. He didn't deliver Paul from being in the storm. He was with him in the storm. And that's important. Sometimes we think, well, we need to just be delivered completely from this storm, that it doesn't exist at all. But that's not what the Bible teaches. We're going to be there in the storm, but the Lord's going to be with us. He comforted Paul with assurance that he would survive. But we're not immune to those kind of storms. If you turn to Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5, you'll see it says, for he himself has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. Now, think about those two terms, leave you or forsake you. Notice what's missing from those two terms. At no point in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5 does it say, I will never go through difficult challenges. Does it say that? It never does. We're not promised anything like that. But we are promised that God would be with us. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5, and you can debate who the writer of Hebrews is, but if the writer of Hebrews is Paul, this sentence makes a whole lot of sense based on what he just experienced in the last couple of chapters there in Acts. The Lord was with Paul in the storm. Number 3. Our work for the Lord is never done. Paul, do you find it interesting that in what we had read, and if you go back, I'd encourage you to go back and read all of Acts chapter 27 and 28 when you have a little bit of time. But on this trip where Paul is a prisoner, he was afforded an opportunity when the boat stopped so he could go and talk to other Christians that he would come in contact with, a place that, I don't know, he had established or he had helped establish or he had just heard about or whatever it might would be. He took a little time to go and talk to those people while he was there. Think about that for just a second. He realized that he was on his way to Rome. He was going to appeal to Caesar, and the odds were that he was going to be found guilty. He was going to go to prison and probably going to be put to death if we're just extrapolating what we think will happen right there. But he took the time to say, let's go talk to some other people who might need a little bit of help. Have you ever thought in your mind, I don't think I'll ever survive this one? Guess what? You all have, right? Every one of us have. Why have we all survived? Anybody ever seen the movie Finding Nemo? I don't know if anybody's ever seen the movie Finding Nemo. It's a little fish that's lost. And one of the themes in the movie there is they just keep swimming. Just keep swimming. Just keep swimming. And it seems like you're getting farther and farther away. But what happens when you stop swimming? You're gone there, right? What happens when you're stopped? Our work is never, when we stop swimming, the work's over. But when the work is over and we stop swimming, we're going to the bottom. Our job is to continue. That's a lesson from the storm. 4th one. It might not be as aimless as we think. You know, sometimes one of the things that bothers us is when we do something that seems like it's aimless, right? When there's really not anything to gain from it. If there's nothing that we can do for it. Paul was cast upon an island. The door was open, not for Paul to escape or to run away, but for Paul to extend his ministry, to do even more. Now, how many times have we looked at something? We talked about glasses half empty and half full a few weeks ago. How many times do we look at something and say, this is a way to help me, right? Had Paul been cast upon this island, if he could have escaped, that's a way to help him, right? We might have looked at that and said, how can I make this better for me? Paul goes onto an island and says, this is a way for me to what? To help other people, to teach and preach about Jesus. Paul later says that for him to live is what? To him to live is Christ, but for him to die is gain. He realized while he was living that there was something beneficial for him to do. We often struggle to see the purpose behind the storms in our lives. Everything seems dark. There is no light. We don't really see where is it that I am trying to go. But even through the struggles, Paul found an opportunity to preach and teach the word. Let's turn to Philippians real quick. Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through, I think it says 24, but we may go to 26. Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 24. Now, the book of Philippians will be written a little bit after all of this. So, reading this, that Paul's venture to Rome ends up with him getting to Rome. In fact, I believe Philippians was written while he was in jail there. But if we look at Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 24, the thing here is it may not be as aimless as we think. When we're going through storms, it might open up the door for something a little bit better, starting in verse 12. But I want you to know, brethren, that the things that happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerity, supposing to add affliction to my chains, but the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. There's a little bit more to look at here for just a second, but think about a man in prison making this kind of claim. A man who has went through so many difficulties, so many challenges, so many situations where he could be described as shipwrecked, as facing a storm, as being challenged by something, and it all seemed like it was going to end in death, but it might not have been quite as aimless as it seemed. Verse 19. For I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayers and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness as always. So now also Christ will be magnified by my body, here you go, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. Yet what shall I choose? I cannot tell. Think about that for just a second right there. For me to live is Christ. For me to die is gain. So if I live, there's going to be some benefit. If I die, I'm the one that's going to benefit from it. But if we go back right there in verse 22, but if I live on the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. But the second part of verse 22, yet what shall I choose? I cannot tell. We don't always know what our work's doing, right? We don't always understand the storms that we're going through. But like the movie said, we just keep swimming, right? We just keep swimming. And hopefully something positive will come from it, because we don't know who we're benefiting as a result. 23, for I'm hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. When we look at these storms this storm that Paul was facing, this is just something that most of us probably will never experience. Most of us are probably not going to be on a prison ship loaded with other prisoners and also some grain going from Egypt to Italy. That's pretty rare. But fill in the blanks with the kind of storms that we do face. Think about right now the challenges that you have had to go through in your life. Think about the difficulties that you've had to face, often seemingly by ourselves. Think about the times when you've uttered the phrase, I don't think I'll make it through this. And think about the victory that's you setting right here. And think about the people that have benefited because you're setting right here. Storms of life are difficult. We were never promised anything perfect. But for me to live as Christ and for me to die as gain. Either way, we win. And if the ship had sank and we'd never heard of Paul ever again, we would have suffered as a result. But Paul would have been in heaven a lot sooner than he actually ended up going. All we can hope for here is to try and realize that these hardships, these difficulties, these storms, it's in these that God often does his best work. Don't ever forget that. Don't ever forget that. Through the most difficult things, the best things will come from it. You know where diamonds come from? Come from coal, right? You ever thought about that? Something gross and dirty and nasty. Through the pressure of that, generates something that people would give millions of dollars for in order to be able to have. God's given far greater than that for you. And realize that the difficulties that you go through will only benefit you and benefit everyone you come in contact with as we do it. Whatever storms you're facing, whatever difficulties, whatever challenges, whatever it is, we certainly invite you to come. We can help. Whatever we can do, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.